In the small, isolated town of Waverly, something was amiss. The residents had long been plagued by a mysterious phenomenon, dreams that felt too real, too vivid, and too terrifying. But these weren't ordinary nightmares, they were shared. Night after night, the townspeople experienced the same dream. A dream they couldn't wake from, a dream that bled into reality. Emily Hartman, a young schoolteacher, was the first to notice the pattern. Every morning, her students would come to class with dark circles under their eyes, whispering about the man in the shadows who visited them in their sleep. At first, Emily dismissed it as a collective imagination run wild. But then she started having the dream too. In the dream, she was always in a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their twisted branches blotting out the moonlight. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She could hear whispers, low and indecipherable, as if the forest itself was speaking to her. But it was the figure that terrified her the most, the man in the shadows. He had no face, just a black void where his features should have been, and he would follow her, his presence growing stronger with each passing second. Each night, the dream became more intense, more suffocating. And then, one night, the man in the shadows spoke. "You cannot wake," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You will never wake." Emily awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. But something was different. The line between the dream and reality had blurred. The fog, the whispers, the figure, all of it seemed to follow her into the waking world. The once familiar town of Waverly now felt alien, like a distorted reflection of what it once was. Desperate for answers, Emily sought out the town's oldest resident, Mrs. Whitaker, who had lived in Waverly for nearly a century. Mrs. Whitaker spoke of an ancient curse that had been placed on the town generations ago, a curse born from a terrible betrayal. The Restless Dream was a manifestation of the town's dark past, a past that refused to be forgotten. "There's only one way to break the curse," Mrs. Whitaker said, her voice trembling. "You must confront the man in the shadows. You must face the darkness that lies within the dream and within yourself." That night, Emily returned to the dream, determined to end the nightmare once and for all. As she wandered through the fog-shrouded forest, she could feel the presence of the man in the shadows growing stronger. This time, instead of running, she stood her ground. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice echoing through the trees. The man in the shadows emerged, his form more defined, more solid than before. His void-like face stared at her, and for the first time, she felt a connection, a recognition. He was not just a figure of fear, was a part of her, a reflection of the darkness she had long buried deep within. "You are the dreamer," he whispered, "and the dream." With that, Emily realized the truth. The curse was not just on the town, but on her. The Restless Dream was a manifestation of her own unresolved guilt, her own fears and regrets. To break the curse, she had to let go, to forgive herself and those who had wronged her. In the dream, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the darkness to wash over her. When she opened them again, the forest was gone. The fog had lifted, and the man in the shadows had disappeared. Emily awoke in her bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt at peace. The Restless Dream had ended, and with it, the curse on Waverly was lifted. But as she looked in the mirror, she noticed something strange. In the reflection, just for a moment, she saw the faint outline of a man in the shadows, watching her. The dream might have ended, but the darkness within her would always remain, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. Emily stared at the reflection, her heart pounding in her chest. The man in the shadows was supposed to be gone, banished with the curse. Yet there he was, a fleeting presence, just a whisper of darkness that sent a chill down her spine. For days, Emily tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a lingering echo of the nightmare that had plagued her for so long. But as the days passed, the signs became harder to ignore. It wasn't just the reflection in the mirror, there were other things too. Shadows moving in the corners of her vision, the feeling of being watched, and, most disturbingly, the whispers. The whispers had returned, at first, They were faint, almost imperceptible, but soon they grew louder, more insistent, echoing in her mind during the quiet moments of the day and haunting her dreams at night. They spoke in the same voice as the man in the shadows, and though she couldn't always make out the words, the intent was clear. The darkness was not finished with her. Desperate to escape, Emily decided to leave Waverly. She packed her belongings, leaving behind the life she had known, and moved to a city far from the town's eerie influence. For a while, it seemed to work. The whispers faded, the shadows stopped moving, and Emily began to feel a sense of normalcy creeping back into her life. But it didn't last. One night, after months of peace, Emily had the dream again. She was back in the forest, the twisted trees and fog as oppressive as ever. This time, though, something was different. The man in the shadows was no longer a distant figure. He was standing right in front of her, close enough that she could feel the cold emanating from his presence. "You can't escape," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You are the dreamer, but I am the dream. We are bound, you and I." Emily tried to wake herself, but the dream held her tight, its grip stronger than before. Panic set in as she realized that the peace she had found was just an illusion. The darkness was a part of her, and it would follow her no matter where she went. The next morning, she awoke exhausted, the weight of the dream heavy on her mind. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that she could outdistance the darkness within her. It was clear now that the curse had never truly been lifted. It had merely been waiting, biding its time until she was vulnerable again. Emily knew what she had to do. She had to return to Waverly, to the place where it all began. Only there, in the heart of the cursed town, could she find the answers she sought and perhaps finally break free of the shadow that haunted her. The town was just as she remembered, though it seemed even more desolate now, as if the very life had been drained from it. The once familiar streets were eerily silent, and the few people she passed on the way to her old house seemed hollow, their eyes dull and lifeless. As she approached her former home, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They seemed to pull her toward the old, abandoned schoolhouse at the edge of town, a place she hadn't thought of in years. The schoolhouse had been closed for decades, long before Emily was born. Rumors had always swirled about it being haunted, a place where the restless spirits of the past still lingered. But it wasn't until now that she understood its true significance. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the smell of decay permeating the walls. The whispers guided her to a door at the back of the building, one she had never noticed before. With trembling hands, she pushed it open and descended a narrow staircase that led deep underground. At the bottom, she found herself in a chamber, the walls lined with ancient symbols and runes. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it lay an old, tattered book. The whispers were deafening now, urging her to read, to uncover the truth. With a sense of dread, Emily opened the book. The pages were filled with the same symbols that adorned the walls, but as she stared at them, they began to shift, forming words she could understand. The dreamer and the dream are one. To break the cycle, one must embrace the other, for only in unity can the darkness be banished. Emily realized what it meant. The man in the shadows wasn't just a figment of her imagination, nor was he merely a curse upon the town. He was a part of Hera's manifestation of the darkness she had tried so hard to ignore. To break free, she would have to confront him once more, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of herself. She would have to accept the darkness, to understand it, and to make peace with it. Closing her eyes, Emily allowed the whispers to envelop her, to guide her into the dream one last time. She found herself in the forest again, the man in the shadows waiting for her. But this time, she didn't run. Instead, she stepped forward, reaching out her hand. "I accept you," she whispered. "I accept all of you." The man in the shadows paused, and for a moment, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, he reached out to take her hand. As their fingers touched, the shadows began to dissolve, the darkness lifting from the forest, from the town, and from Emily's heart. The whispers faded into silence, and the oppressive weight that had hung over her for so long finally lifted. Emily awoke, not in her bed, but standing in the schoolhouse chamber. The book was gone. The symbols on the walls had vanished, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. She had done it. The curse was truly broken this time, not just for the town, but for herself. The man in the shadows was gone, not banished or defeated, but integrated, understood, and accepted. As she walked out of the schoolhouse, Emily felt a sense of peace she had never known before. The restless dream was over, and with it, the darkness had finally been laid to rest.